In this video, we're going to take a look at Noodler's Chisholm Trail. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. A much more interesting brown than I had expected. I expected an aggressive ink because of how waterproof it is. It isn't. I expected a dull, flat tone. It's not. Pleasantly surprising all around. It does give a bunch of tone variation by nib, and it shades fairly well most of the time. This performs in a way that I wish more permanent inks actually performed. While permanence isn't something that I generally care about, I could see using this as a permanent ink regularly if more permanent inks performed this way. I hope Noodler's really replicates the performance of this in the future, because a lot of times their more permanent inks are more aggressive. Well done. Absolute winner. This is the best of the Noodler's permanent inks, without a doubt. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Jinhao X750 with a fine nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the fine nib, we get a nice lighter brown, easy to read on the page. It's not feathering, it's not spreading. It is shading like a beast, constantly all over the place, in and out of darker and lighter tones. Really just astounding. I was not expecting this at all. I really figured that the soft fine was going to expose weakness in this ink, and it didn't. It showed an additional strength. Looking at the broad nib, it is just a little bit darker than what we tend to see with that soft fine. It still doesn't feather, still doesn't spread. It shades, though not as well as the soft fine did. It still is shading, but you kind of have to pick and choose at your areas for it. I mean, you can see it on some of the end of the words where it tends to get a little darker just at the end where some of the ink gets to pool. Not a ton of shading within the words, though. Looking at the music nib, we get a much darker tone than we had with the broad or the soft fine. Great looking brown here. It doesn't feather. It doesn't spread. It shades very nicely. Look at how when it's shading, like on new in the first line, it goes from a nice brown to almost black back to brown again. And it shades that way frequently. You see it in geometry, might. It's really very nice. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting. Well done. I was expecting more aggression. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib. A Platinum 3776 with a broad nib. A Platinum 3776 with a music nib. The next writing sample is done on a WritePad's reporter pad. Looking at the soft fine nib, we get about the same tone that we had with the Clairfontaine. We get no feather. We get no spread. We get the same amount of shading and in the same way as we had it on the Clairfontaine. And with the waterproof nature of this ink, and as quickly as it dries, it really makes it a great ink to use in the situation of writing in reporter notebooks. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone that we got on the Clairfontaine. A little bit darker than we had with the soft fine here on this paper. It's not feathering. It's not spreading. I think the shading is showing a little bit better here than it did on the Clairfontaine, as when it's shading, it's getting a little darker, though the majority of the writing is coming up pretty monotone, so it's not the best look for this ink. Looking at the music nib, it is much darker than the broad or the soft fine. It is the same tones that we got on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather. It does not spread. It does shade very well. It's not doing it as frequently as it did on the Clairfontaine, but that's not in itself a surprise. But it is nice to see it shade so well on this non-fountain pen friendly paper. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and have no problems. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done in a FieldNotes reporter's notebook. Looking at the soft fine nib, we have roughly the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. We still get no feathering. We still get no spread. We still get shading, and again, I think the shading is showing up a little bit better here than it did on the Clairfontaine. In this case, I do think that the more absorbent papers tend to work to this ink's advantage in helping it shade. Looking at the broad nib, we get just about the same tone that we had on the Clairfontaine. It's only a tad bit darker. It still's not feathering. It still is not spreading. It still is shading, and it is shading better here than it did on the Clairfontaine. Not tons, not huge standout, but much better than it did before. Looking at the music nib, it is the darkest tone on the page. It is also a little bit lighter than we had on the Clairfontaine. It's not feathering. It's not spreading. It's not shading, though. In this case, we've lost all the shade, and the only thing we have is a very solid dark brown that loses quite a bit of its character in how it looks. It looks rather plain in this case compared to how it has. Looking at the back of the page, you see that we have no bleeding, no ghosting, no issues. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a Portage reporter's notebook. Looking at the soft fine, we're getting the same tone as the Clairfontaine. With no feathering, with no spread, with shading that is doing very well, but it is not showing itself as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. I think it's a very respectable look, respectable in its amount of shading. Just we've seen so much more from it that it here looks a little disappointing. Looking at the broad nib, it is darker than we had with the soft fine nib. It is just a tad bit lighter than we had on the Clairfontaine. It is not feathering or spreading. It is also not shading. Now, this brown as a solid tone is not my preference. I don't think it looks bad. It's just that I know I can get a lot of browns that look like this and shade incredibly well. It's just not doing it on this paper. Looking at the music nib, it is a little darker than we had with the broad, a little lighter than we had on the Clairfontaine. It still doesn't feather. It still doesn't spread. There's only a couple of dots of shading that show up. It's really not. It's giving a very monotone, just there brown. Not a bad brown. As far as this versus the broad, I prefer this brown just a little bit more. But again, I know I can get this as a shading brown. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and have no problems. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Ackerman number 22. Here is Diamine Raw Sienna. Here is KWZ Brown number 2. Here is Robert Oster Khaki. The next writing sample is done in an Office Depot reporter's notebook. Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a little bit darker than we had on the Clairfontaine. It does feather a little bit. It does spread a little bit. Tiny. I only see it because I'm looking at them side by side. It does shade, which for this paper makes me really worry, but this ink's been doing so well, I am really on its side here to hold out. Looking at the broad nib, it is just a tad bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine, quite a bit darker than it is here in the soft fine. It's not feathering. No, habit right there. It is feathering. It is with a little bit of spread. It is not shading. I don't think this paper really does make this ink look good. None of these three tones are honestly for me on this paper. Looking at the music nib, it is darker than it was with the broad or the soft fine on this paper. It is a little bit lighter and duller in tone than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does spread a little bit and feather a little bit. Both are well manageable considering how inexpensive these notebooks are. It does not shade at all, and that leaves me feeling a bit lackluster about seeing it on the page. Looking at the back of the page, you see that there is a lot of ghosting, and I don't think you could write back here. But none of this came through, none of it bled, nothing touched the page underneath. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a pink ink by Diamine, their Flamingo Pink. Here is a green ink by Mont Blanc, their Jonathan Swift. Here is an orange ink by Pen BBS, their 138 Spessartine. Here is a blue-black ink by Robert Oster, Blue Black. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the soft fine nib, it is a bit darker than we had with the Clairfontaine. It does feather, though very tiny and incredibly manageable. It spreads, and that's much more noticeable than the feathering. Now, even the spread that's occurring actually here doesn't look too bad. It's doing pretty good. It's mostly spreading when I'm on the downstroke, and the nibs would come a little farther apart, giving it little bits of shading. Looking at the broad nib, it is a little darker than we had on the Clairfontaine, quite a bit darker than it was here with the soft fine. It does feather a little bit. It does spread a little bit. Both the feather and the spread are well within what I would consider acceptable on this paper. It's not shading, and I would be surprised to have seen it shade on this. However, this ink did surprise me a lot with where it was shading. Looking at the music nib, it is a bit darker than we got on the broad or the soft fine, and it is also a little lighter than what we were seeing with the Clairfontaine. We do see that it has little bits of feather, tiny, truly tiny, insignificant in its feathering. It does spread, but again, I'm going to call it insignificant, especially considering this paper. It's not shading, which could be a good sign. Looking at the page underneath, you see that there's a lot of circled spots where it did bleed through and touch those pages. And when you see the back of the page, you understand why, with the amount of ghosting that's going on, I don't think you could write on the back of the page. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? While this ink generally does look good from every nib, for me, I really liked the darker tone and how it shaded to that almost black. I want a wet, 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 broad, or stub to really bring out this color. The shading, what I was seeing here really made me a fan of this ink, and I enjoyed using it the entire time, though I'm not willing, I'm not shy about saying that I'm a fan of Noodler's inks, even though I've had a few this past year that I didn't care for as much. This one is great. I hope you got something out of this video, and if you want to support the channel, you can over on Patreon. Thanks for watching.